Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you all over the world. From all of us, from the International Commission on Occupational Health, particularly the Scientific Committee on Mining Occupational Safety and Health, or MinOSH. Welcome to our first webinar series entitled The Silica-Tubercolosis Link, Updating the Relationship and Prevention Practices webinar. We are indeed very glad that we have a large number of participants and registrants, a total of 540 coming from 89 countries, 69 countries, I should say, literally representing the various continents of the globe. I am Jinky Lu, your host today, together with Dr. Eric Jors, the chair of MinOSH. To introduce MinOSH in this webinar series, we have Dr. Eric Jors. Eric Jors is a medical doctor, PhD, and has a master in international health. He is a senior consultant at Odense University Hospital and associate professor at the University of Southern Denmark. He is a specialist in occupational and environmental health. He is the founder and former president of the non-government organization called Dialogos. He is also the founder of the International Committee of Public and Occupational Health within the Danish Society of Occupational Health. He has a working experience at grassroots level in Bolivia, Uganda, and Nepal since 1985. He is the chair of MinOSH since its start in 2015. Please welcome Eric Jors.
Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining this first webinar of MinOSH, so kindly organized by our Indonesian colleagues. You just heard Jinky Lu, who is our secretary in MinOSH. She is affiliated with the National Institutes of Health and the University of Philippines in Manila as a research professor. Jinky Lu is a staunch advocate, both as an engaged academic and scientist in promoting well-being through occupational epidemiology and health policy of vulnerable populations such as small-scale miners. Jinky is also an author of numerous books and articles. We like very much to have her as our secretary in MinOSH. Now, MinOSH is a scientific committee within ICOH, hosting many, I think 30-something, 7 scientific committees. And we were started in Seoul in 2015 to promote occupational health and safety in mining. And since then, we have celebrated several conferences and also published papers on occupational health and safety in mining. The first conference was in Odense in 2017, where actually the idea of pushing the agenda of prevention of tuberculosis and silicosis in mining was brought forward by Perry Gottesfield, who is going to talk today. The next conference was in Bali in Indonesia in 2019. Now this year, we could not have a normal conference, so we have postponed it to next year, where we will organize it at the end of September in Kampala in Uganda. That will be probably a hybrid conference, so you can attend whether you are there or you're sitting at home. This year we have several webinars. After this first webinar, we'll continue at the end of August with a webinar on prevention of mercury poisonings in gold mining. And in October, we'll join forces again with the Indonesians on their conference on occupational health and safety and have a virtual conference of minors. Now, with these words, I'll not take more of your time, but I'll introduce our next speaker, and that is Marilyn Fingerhut from the US. Marilyn is world famous, I should say. She has been working for many years in occupational health and safety at a global level. And she has also been recognized by several prizes for this remarkable work that she has been doing, pushing all of us forward to engage in occupational health and safety. Marilyn is retired, but is still consulting for the United States National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health, also known as NIOSH. She is a former vice president of ICOH, our International Commission on Occupational Health, and led by Perry and Marilyn, ICOH members globally and other partners reached out to country ministers in the UN and achieved an inclusion of wording in the 2018 United Nations TB resolution that commits countries to prevent exposures for high-risk workers, those exposed to silica dust, and health workers. She will provide a brief description of this today as background for our four speakers. Welcome to Marilyn. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you. And I certainly hope that you will, whoops, sorry, I slide. Let me start over. The brief background that I'll present, actually, thank you, dear Eric, for your kind words. In one summary sentence, as he said, by signing the 2018 United Nations Tuberculosis Resolution, all countries committed to reduce workplace silica dust exposure. This link that is here will be on each slide. That tells the whole story. Please copy it down or take a photo. I also would like to share our goals for today. In addition to your learning from our speakers who will provide some recent information, we seek your ideas and suggestions on follow-up actions to better take our Silica TB initiative forward. For example, how do we better engage with national TB programs? How do we better encourage national silica standards? How do we call for more actions around protecting workers at great risk? And we invite you to please consider joining our ICOH-TB Silica subcommittee. You can do that by contacting me or Perry at these emails. Here's the story. The United Nations General Assembly never holds meetings on health-related issues because that belongs to WHO, except when there's a global crisis. On September 26, 2018, the United Nations held a meeting to address the global TB epidemic, which is rampant in many low-resource countries, but not well recognized in developed countries because they've managed to control it better. However, all countries, by signing this resolution, as Eric indicated, have committed to this wording. They must implement primary prevention in high-risk occupations by reducing silica dust exposure in mining, construction, and other dusty workplaces, and worker tuberculosis surveillance and infection prevention and control in healthcare settings. So, silica dust exposed workers and health workers, the high-risk groups. The wording's important because the global community is focused on treatment, not on prevention. It's prevention that's needed for high-risk workers, these and others. Our effort began with development of ICOH-TB statements that provide evidence and suggestions for action. The entire story of how we and our global partners everywhere did this and the ICOH statements can be found at the link. Now, here we are, really happy outside the UN building after the resolution has passed. In the center are handsome Perry Gottsville. I'm to his right, and as you know, we're co-chairs of the ICOH-TB Silica subcommittee. To Perry's left is Gwen Brockman, and to the far right in the picture is Sophie Kisting. They are the co-chairs of the ICOH-TB Health Worker Subcommittee. To the far left is Andrea Hittinger. She is chair of the International Occupational Hygiene Association, IOHA, TB subcommittee. IOHA has 10,000 industrial hygienists. So we would like you to please consider the goals that I described for you. And in addition to questions for the speakers, please provide them as the speakers are speaking. We also ask you to put your suggestions in the chat box. That can be done anytime. Your questions and suggestions will be discussed during the question and answer period at the end of the presentations. I turn this back to Jinky now to introduce our first speaker.
Jinky, you have to unmute yourself.
Whoops.
Jinky, please unmute yourself.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Our first speaker is Dr. Rodney Ehrlich. He is a specialist in occupational medicine and public health, and currently emeritus professor and senior research scholar of the School of Public Health and Family Medicine of the University of Cape Town in South Africa. His career has encompassed clinical practice, teaching, research, policy support, and advocacy. Rodney is also the past co-editor-in-chief of the prestigious American Journal of Industrial Medicine. His research interests include the health and compensation of former miners in Southern Africa, as well as other areas such as clinical and epidemiologic aspects of silicosis and pulmonary tuberculosis. Let us all welcome Rodney Ehrlich to talk on silica and tuberculosis, updating the causal relationship.
Thanks, Jinky Lou, and welcome to all our colleagues from around the world, quite remarkable, different time zones, and thanks to MinOSH for inviting me to make this presentation, and I credit my co-authors in the work I'm going to present, Paula Akuguzibwe, Nandi Siegfried, and David Rees. What is the relevance of the subject that it requires a webinar of its own? Well, I think it's probably common cause to everybody on this webinar that there are huge numbers of workers still exposed to silica extractive industries, traditionally construction, foundries, ceramics, more recently engineered stone, and agriculture. However, what's less well appreciated is that many of these populations are in high TB burden countries. And here the so-called countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and Indonesia, partly because of our hosts, partly because it's a massive country and has an emerging extractive and mining industry. So the underlying observation is that co-exposure to terrestrial silica and Mycobacterium tuberculosis is common. However, from a South African perspective, we have been grappling, not us individually, but the country, society, with the problem for 140 years, since the initiation of deep-level gold mining in the 1880s. However, when you look at the modern literature, although there are publications available from these and above countries, some others, it's clear to us, or it's our view, that the problem of silica and tuberculosis jointly, which we're going to call silica-tuberculosis, is underappreciated and under-researched. So we undertook a systematic review. Why a systematic review now? So from our initial search of the literature, we could find only one, and that was a traditional review written by a Brazilian colleague in the modern literature of silica and tuberculosis. None were systematic, or this review wasn't systematic, and there were no others. If you look at the reviews of silica and silicosis, and there are a number of authoritative reviews, for example, the ICOH review, which I think was 2012, I'm wrong there. There are a number of marked limitations from our perspective. First of all, because of the spread across all what they call the complications of silicosis, there is no quality assessment of publication, certainly not in the field of silica-tuberculosis. There's also no distinction made between the outcome, and particularly between mortality from tuberculosis and TB disease incidence. And this is a problem because to show an etiological effect in cohort studies which rely entirely on death certification raises a number of problems of validity. I'm not going to go into it in any detail, and you'll see how we dealt with it in this particular study. And finally, there's almost no appreciation of the extent to which silicosis is not visible on the plain chest X-ray, and to a large extent, current perspective, on the CT scan either. So there's very little work on this, mainly coming from South Africa, not our work, although we summarized it in a 2018 publication, that in minors, up to 70% of silicosis apparent at autopsy is not apparent on the chest X-ray. And even the marked or severe silicosis at autopsy is also invisible on the chest X-ray. These are all important considerations when we think about silica and tuberculosis. So we undertook a systematic review with a meta-analysis. The primary objectives were to assess the association between TB and silicosis, number one, and secondly, between silica exposure controlling for silicosis and tuberculosis. A secondary objective was to identify a threshold of effect via disease exposure relationships and TB. And the importance of this secondary objective is that when you read the reviews, tuberculosis is seen as a complication of silicosis, but there's almost no focus on what needs to be known or understood to prevent this complication other than prevention of silicosis. But that has to be interrogated more closely. I'm not going to go through the methods of the systematic review in any detail. I'm sorry about all these acronyms, and I'm not going to spell them out. The protocol was registered on the International Protocol Register, known as Prospero. The guideline for observational studies of effect, PRISMA, was used. We searched the databases PubMed and Embase electronically. To assess the risk of bias in each individual study, we used a schema used for observational studies of etiology, the Newcastle associations, the Newcastle-Ottawa scale, and finally, to weigh up the degree of confidence that we could have in the evidence as a whole, we used the GRADE schema. Our inclusion criteria were all case control, well, not all, sorry, were case control and cohort studies. Studies with TB incidence as outcome with the diagnostic method specified, and silicosis, studies of silicosis or silica exposure temporarily prior to tuberculosis diagnosis with diagnostic method or exposure metric specified. We excluded case series, surveillance reports. Notably, we excluded mortality studies and we excluded cross-sectional studies. Found 2,486 unique abstracts. We read 23 articles in full, and we ended up with 9 studies, 2 case control, and 7 cohort. I'm going to move straight to the forest plot. This is the meta-analysis of the studies of silicosis, the disease, and tuberculosis, and there are 9 of them from Hong Kong, Iran, Taiwan, Denmark, and Sweden. which we've stratified as low or intermediate TB burden countries, and 4 from high tuberculosis burden countries, all South African. I just want to focus on the main finding. This is the pooled meta-analysis of relative risk of the 9 studies, and the relative risk, without excluding any studies, is approximately 4 times the risk of developing tuberculosis if you have silicosis. The odds ratio, the confidence interval from about 3 to about 6. In the stratification by burden, TB burden, it's quite interesting to notice that the low burden countries had a higher relative risk, pooled relative risk, than the high TB burden countries. And there are various explanations. One can speculate on this, and perhaps that's something we can consider later. We were unable to do a meta-analysis of dose severity response, but this is a histogram of the effect on TB, or the relative risk or odds of TB for different levels of silicosis, here described usually by the ILO, in fact all of them by the ILO classification of severity of silicosis. And the effect, as you can see, is monotonic and steeply rising in most of them. As silicosis is more severe, the risk of TB rises. The meta-analysis of silica exposure controlling for silicosis, and this was done in 2 ways. Some studies excluded those with silicosis. Others included silicosis as a confounder in the regression analysis. This was a smaller group of studies, 1 from Denmark and 1 from Iran in the low intermediate TB burden group, and 3 from South Africa, the high TB burden group. This relative risk was somewhat lower than seen for silicosis, 1.92, just under 2. And again, the difference between high and low burden TB countries was in the same direction. Unable to do meta-analysis on this case, the exposure response ordinal data, we used whatever metric the study used, either duration of exposure, cumulative dust, which includes duration and concentration, and other metrics such as surface underground, no exposure versus any exposure. So the metric here was heterogeneous. And again, the general trend is for an increase in the odds or risk of TB with increased dust exposure, but not consistently so. With regard to threshold of effect, in respect of silicosis, the effect of the increase in TB was apparent at a relatively low ILO grade. For those who understand the ILO classification, approximately around 1.0 or 1.1. And even on the 1 biopsy autopsy study, at sub-radiological level, even without TB on the chest on silicosis on the chest X-ray, with increasing pathology at autopsy, the TB risk increased. That study will have to be read to understand its intricacies. However, looking at silica alone, controlling for silicosis, there was a threshold was not identifiable because the exposure metrics were not sufficiently stratified or granular enough by airborne silica concentration, which in fact was only used in 1 study. Our main findings, therefore, looking at all the evidence, that we have high confidence in grade language, that there is a strong in the association between silicosis TB, and that the association is strong. By that I mean greater than 2.5 relative risk. There is a low threshold of silicosis of effect. Therefore, the high or historical exposures are not a requirement for an effect of silicosis on tuberculosis, but very much a product of our current exposures. We have, however, low confidence using grade language in the effect estimate for silica controlling for silicosis. And the reason that it's kept at low, based on the relatively few studies and the fact that all of them used surrogate metrics for cumulative exposure, except 1. However, the exposure response gradients are suggestive, and although not presented in the evidence, there is biological plausibility from laboratory work. Threshold of effect was not accessible. So to finish off, the implications for control and management of silicosis and TB. Firstly, the common cause, and will be a strong message of this webinar, control of airborne silica is an important control strategy for tuberculosis in high TB burden countries with silica-exposed populations, and there are many. Secondly, we need an understanding of the role of, or better understanding of the role of silica and silicosis in diagnosis, treatment success, and chemoprophylaxis of TB. This is really directed at the clinicians, and I think silica-tuberculosis outside the mining industry has been sorely neglected in clinical medicine. And thirdly, that an understanding of the association between silica and TB is relevant medico-legally. For example, or specifically in workers' compensation, our view is that you do not need silicosis on the chest X-ray, on the plain film, to determine, to conclude on medico-legal grounds that tuberculosis in a silica-exposed worker is occupational. And finally, the implications for research and surveillance, which has been a theme, as you can see, a thread through the study. We need studies from other high TB burden countries other than South Africa. Where is China, India, Brazil, Indonesia? By studies, I mean studies along the lines that I've been talking about. We need surveillance of incident TB in silica-exposed populations, and this requires a partnership with public health. Because once you have surveillance in place and are picking up all the incident TB cases, the underlying association and its severity should become clear to the public health authorities and not only to the occupational health community. And the studies that we require, the formal studies, really are studies which need to measure residual silica dust concentration, also sorely lacking, and incident tuberculosis. The two references I've exposed, well, the reference for this study, it's about to be published in the BMC Public Health, not quite online, and if you're interested in subradiological silicosis, I include that 2018 study here. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rodney, for alerting us to the fact that TB is actually a complication of silicosis, and this has to be looked into specifically, especially for medical-legal issues. Our next speaker is Dr. Eduardo Algranti. Eduardo graduated in medicine in 1975 and a fellow in international medicine. He worked as a visiting fellow at the MRC pneumoconiosis unit. He has a master's in pulmonology at the University of Wales and PhD in public health at the University of Sao Paulo. He has been a certified B reader of NIOS USA since 1988. He is currently a researcher at Fundacentro in Sao Paulo and a member of the Collegium Ramazzini. Eduardo's areas of interest are pulmonology and public health, with an emphasis in clinical epidemiology, specifically epidemiology and clinical aspects of exposure to silica and asbestos, occupational asthma, and imaging methods in occupational lung diseases. To talk on mortality from silicosis in Brazil, we have Eduardo.
Thank you, Jinky, for this introduction. Good day or good evening for all attendants. I would like to thank again the ICO and the MinOSH for inviting me for this seminar. I'm going to talk on mortality from silicosis in Brazil, and it's a work done in conjunction with 4 other colleagues, and that I'm acknowledging now. We have no conflicts of interest, and all databases that we're using this study is publicly available, and here is the reference for this research that was published in the beginning of this year. Okay, you see these photographs here relate to examples of jobs carrying high risk of silica exposure, like sandblasting, underground gold mining, pit digging, or in the ceramic industry. So those were jobs that fortunately are fairly well controlled now in Brazil, but were responsible for much of the mortality that we're going to discuss today. Okay, we're analyzing a data set of deaths coming from the Brazilian mortality system, where silicosis was the underlying cause in adults of 20 years of age and over, from 1980 to 2017. So we spent over a 38-year period. And we also analyzed a smaller data set from 2000 to 2017, after the Brazilian electronic mortality database started to show also the contributing causes of death. So in this first data set, there were 3,164 deaths, mostly in men, with a mean age of 59.2 years. So what we did with this information, we calculated the standardized mortality rates using the Brazilian 2010 population. Then we calculated the trend in mortality by joint point regression. The mortality rates were then calculated for each municipality using person years as denominator. We draw maps of geographical distribution and mortality clustering. And finally, we also looked at ICD-10 codes for the underlying cause of death when silicosis was a contributing cause. So these graphs display the regression trends for the whole group of more than 3,000 deaths in A, and in B, they're split in age ranges. So you see that for the whole group, there was an increase in the death rate until 2006, and the decrease following after it until 2017. When we look at age ranges, we see that in the younger group, from 20 to 49, which is a lower set, the decrease started only more recently by 2013. For the people aged 50 to 69, the mortality stopped to increase at the same time as for the whole group, because most of the deaths were concentrated in this age group. And interestingly, for the older, 70 years of age and over, there was no decrease at all during the whole period. So in the death certificate, there's a specific field to register the occupation. It is not a mandatory field to fill, but when filled, the data often is not of any use. There are lots of retired or housewives. So attempting to overcome this limitation, we opted to analyze areas where there was a predominant activity related to silica exposure. And we managed to identify 5 groups of municipalities where there was sand mining, pit digging, ceramics, precious and semi-precious stone mining or stone carving, and gold mining. In each group, there were at least 2 municipalities. We then calculated the mean mortality rates per person years and display against decades, as you can see here in this graph. So you can see different trends according to occupation. For instance, for sand mining, there was a slight decrease throughout the analyzed period. Whereas for pit digging, there was a sharp rise that reached the upper limit in the 90s, and then a sharp decrease. We can discuss this after. For ceramics and even for gold mining, which are more regulated sectors, the trend was relatively stable along these decades. And for the informal sector represented by precious and semi-precious mining or stone carving, there was an increase in recent years. And when we see rates per 1,000 person years, the highest rate was in a municipality where there was amethyst mining in the south of the country. And then what's very interesting is about the mean age of death in each of these 5 groups. For instance, people who got silicosis from pit digging were dying at a mean age of about 49 years. And in precious mining and stone carving, 51 years. If you compare with, for example, gold mining or ceramics, which is a more regulated sectors, you can just guess what is exposure in these informal sectors. So we then estimate mortality rates per person years in each state of the federation in Brazil. And 6 states presented rates higher than for the whole country. The whole country was about 0.7 per 100,000 person years. And you got 6 states, which is above the mean mortality for Brazil. For instance, here in the state of Piauí, there was 3.6 times the rate for Brazil, and here in Minas Gerais, 2.6 times the rate. So you can see here maps displaying ranges of mortality rate for the Brazilian states in this top left graph by mortality ranges in person years. And you can see here the state of Piauí, Minas Gerais, and Rio Grande do Sul. You see here, this arrow is pointing to the gold mining area in Minas Gerais, and the second arrow is pointing to the area of amethyst mining in the south of the country, where we saw the highest rates of mortality in the whole, in all municipalities showing deaths from silicosis. So we also looked at, as I said before, a subset of data from 2000 to 2017, where silicosis was not the underlying, but a contributing cause of death. And there was 813 deaths. And the main cause of death when silicosis was a contributing cause was TB and non-tuberculous mycobacteria, responsible for 19% of it. Then you have here COPD, about 14%, lung cancer, 2.8%, and autoimmune diseases and renal diseases, 2.4%. So there was a high burden of silica-related disease mortality in this group also. So how does our findings compare with we know from the literature? So we have here a couple of papers published. The first one published in Italy in 2017, analyzing mortality from 2000 to 2012 with a fairly high number of yearly deaths in Italy, and presenting a downward trend for the whole period. So the second paper was published in 2015 by Bang and collaborators in the US with a mean of 143 silicosis deaths during this period. Here is underlying and contributing case. Here the Italian paper is just underlying cause. And here are, the analysis that we just presented and the subsets from 2000 to 2017. But what called attention here is the mean age of death. For instance, in Italy, people with silicosis are dying at an age which is relatively close to the life expectancy in men. The same happening in the US, in contrast, contrasting with what's happening in Brazil, with very early mortality in people dying with or from silicosis. So you can guess that we still have, when we had very bad exposure situations in the country. So there's a number of final comments here. In contrast with developed countries, mortality from silicosis rose until 2006, when it started to drop, mostly from a plateau, in that from municipalities harboring regulated activities like gold mining and ceramics. So the lack of decline in mortality in the older age group possibly is a reflection of the stock of subjects with prolonged exposures and chronic silicosis. The recent decline in mortality in the 50 to 69 and 20 to 49 age groups should be related to improvements in primary prevention. We prohibit sandblasting 16 years ago in the country. So there is some sandblasting, very well hidden, but it was mostly abolished in the whole country. So that's due to silicosis in Brazil are associated on average with a 7-year loss in life expectancy in men. Silicosis induces an increase in mortality from tuberculosis, other mycobacteriosis, COPD, and other silica-related diseases. And we certainly need more studies to estimate the burden of tuberculosis mortality, silica exposure, and COPD. You just heard Rodney speaking on need for further research. And I would like also to underline the need for prevention of TB studies in silica-exposed groups. We had some very old papers from the decades of 50 and 60 in Eastern Europe, but very few papers addressing prevention of tuberculosis in silica-exposed groups. So in the analyzed period, the main clusters of death from silicosis are located all over the country. You're just seen in the Northeast, in the Southeast, and in the South. But it's a ubiquitous disease. And finally, you see here what we've been seeing more recently. Here you see a picture of a worker in the silicone rubber industry. So we saw a bad epidemic of advanced silicosis in people producing silicone rubber. They were mixing silicone with silica flour, which is crystalline silica ground in a very fine mesh. So they use silica flour to get lower costs of production. They don't need to use silica flour to produce silicone rubber. So here you see countertops of materials made mostly from crystalline silica, like silestone. We don't have much data of these countertop productions in Brazil, but it's been described in several countries now. And here is the informal sector carving semi-precious stones, which is a very common activity in the country. And I thank you, and we could proceed also with questions in the discussion part. Thank you very much. Jinky, you're on. You have to unmute.
Jinky, please unmute yourself.
I have unmuted myself. Okay. Thank you very much, Eduardo. Eduardo has actually shown us that silicosis is a deadly disease and can be a contributory cause of death. And silicosis in Brazil is actually work-related, specifically also to mining. And this should be a cause of concern. For our next talk, we have René Leblanc. René graduated with a bachelor degree in chemistry. He has a master's degree in occupational and environmental health from Montreal University in 2002. After joining the occupational hygiene community, he was the president of the Canadian Registration Board of Occupational Hygienists in 2018 and immediate past president of the International Occupational Hygiene Association, or IOHA, in 2020. He strongly advocates the increasing presence and participation of occupational hygienists in the international arena in order to improve primary prevention on the field. He currently sits on the International Labor Organization Committee for Vision Zero at enterprise level. He is also a member of the organizing committee of the Vision Zero Second International Summit in Japan to be held in May 2022. To discuss and share with us the prevention activity to reduce silica exposure, please welcome René Leblanc.
Thank you very much, Jinky, and thanks to ICOH and MinOSH for inviting IOHA to present at this webinar. We are very pleased to be with you today. Welcome to every attendees as well. We are pleased to have you. And as Marilyn introduced in her opening statement, IOHA was there at the United Nations for the resolution on TB, and the resolution discussed about primary prevention. So I wanted to take this opportunity today to talk a little more about the primary prevention and what can be done to reduce exposure at the source. So on brief word on IOHA, we are an association of occupational hygienists. We are located with association in 35 countries. We have a pretty interesting international representation. We wish we were more present in Africa and in Arabic countries, but it's a work in progress. We're just working to increase our presence and to help workers on the prevention. So for us, the occupational hygienists, the importance is really to understand work and contaminant activity, facility behaviors on the field. So our work is really to go on sites and assess what are the type of mining activity, coal, metals, potash, limestone. So is it surface mining, underground mining, the process and equipment being used? What are the physical chemical property of contaminants? In this case, we have silicosis, silica and TB, which are both very tiny materials or organisms that can go deep into the lungs and in alveoli. Of course, we need to understand the concept of communicable and non-communicable disease, and then the work schedule, shift duration, the formal versus informal mining, and of course, the presence of supervision and enforcement, which is very important. So we follow the hierarchy of control. Here I present the NIOSH hierarchy of control, which is largely accepted worldwide. So basically, we attempt, as we could see and as we could experiment with the COVID-19 fight, we're always trying to prioritize some activities that will reduce at the source. So the elimination of the hazard, and then the substitution when it's possible. Then we will introduce engineering control and administrative control. And theoretically, the personal protective equipment is kind of a last resort. So I refer you to two very interesting documents that have been published. One was just in March 2019, which is Dust Control Handbook for Industrial Minerals, Mining and Processing. That both documents can be found free online. And there's the May 2010 Best Practices for Dust Control in Metal, Non-Metal Mining. These documents are very interesting and are a great resource to help you control and reduce on-site exposure. So, of course, we will see for us, with respect to engineering control, it's important to really understand what are the activities. So it's for us, what we do what we call job risk analysis. We try to assess for each of the items we see on the right, whether it's wet spray system, drilling and blasting, crushing, milling, screening, conveying, and transport. Each of these activities have different risk and have different equipment or different process that are being used in many locations. So it's important that we do a task assessment. We look on a step-by-step, and we see what activity is most at risk. And on the left, you see one of the technology that can be used in some advanced processing. We can use a camera and use a direct monitoring equipment in parallel. So it allows us to do some kind of a video and understand what are the peak activity that really you can see an increase exposure during that specific task. And then you can really concentrate on that specific task to reduce the global exposure on a longer period. So, of course, there's been a lot of evolution over the equipment over the years. And as we can see in the bottom here, in the past, we used to use canneries as our monitoring equipment to assess the level of oxygen inside of the mining. So, of course, the new technology are being used, and some of these can reduce significantly the exposure of worker, but some other process may just increase the potential exposure. So it's really important to well understand the machinery and equipment. When it comes to ventilation and wetting, these are the two main solutions that we bring on site to control potential exposure to silica. When we talk about ventilation, it's either we bring fresh air or we increase the air exchange. But as I indicate in the bottom here, there's a difference between aeration and extraction. So I'll discuss more about this at the next slide. But we can use different technology that are available, such as a recent study conducted under ICOH, which is a mobile dry scrubber. So it's some equipment that really can reduce the level of concentrations of silica and particulates in the air. So this slide, I just want to show you a more detailed information with respect to pulling the air or pushing the air. So when you do the extraction, when you use filter, it's a little bit like your vacuum. You have to understand that the radius of efficiency is very tiny, and it can be increased like we can see in B. If you put some lateral panels, you can increase the radius of efficiency, but still you can see that about at one radius of the extraction system, you will see almost no flow rate. So this is completely the contrary when you see in the bottom that when you use a push system, you will definitely have a radius of operation and an efficiency up to 30 times the diameter. And definitely this can be very interesting to reduce the silica concentration, but this can also increase the TB dispersion. So at Ideally, we try always to eliminate at the source. So our objective is not to typically to disperse the contaminant. It's more to extract it from the source. But this means that you need really to have lots of a large quantity of extraction system, and they have to be very well located at specific locations where you can have an effective effect. Otherwise, if you put them too far away from the source, you may have just almost no effect. So it's important that when we speak about ventilation and filtration, you need to really understand the right location and the right equipment that has to be located at the precise location. And we saw that also with COVID-19. Some people expressed some concern about putting ventilation into some classroom because you may spread the COVID-19. So that's what happened with communicable disease. You have to be very careful with respect to the ventilation, not to increase the potential exposure for other workers. So ventilation is one very important way to control exposure, but wetting is also a very much applied process that is used worldwide. Basically, we use water and we just abate the dust. The addition of droplets to the particulate increase their weight so that they will just drop down, and it will reduce airborne concentration. So it's efficient in some environment. You always need to look at the different concept here indicated on your right. So you need the proper application of moisture. You cannot have too much. You cannot have not enough. You need a careful nozzle location, controlling the droplet size, choose the best spray pattern and spray nozzle type. So it's more complex than just saying, you know, let's spray some water. You need really to use the right system. Of course, it depends on water availability. We understand that in many countries worldwide, the water is a huge problem, water access. So, and in some cases, we will use some wetting agent that can increase also the longevity or the reduced surface tension that basically lower the volume of water that you may require to produce droplets. Of course, use of water has to be considered as well to ensure that it will not become a vector of contaminated water. There's been some studies. One is referred in the bottom here about potential exposure of workers to Legionella due to using of some contaminated water that you spray and you disperse in the air. And at some point you may have some additional risks that are introduced in the workplace. So with respect to administrative measures, definitely education and training is a basic concept that has to be increased. We really need the employers and the government to put more support with respect to education and training, make sure that the employees and the workers are well trained. Of course, with respect to communicable disease, there's always the social distancing, as we could see in the current pandemic. And of course, there's different other administrative measures that can be implemented, like restricting the task to those that are competent, using job rotation or just work rest schedules. In last resort, as we mentioned, the respiratory protection, there's different types of respiratory equipment that are available. I'm really only talking about particulate filtering. I'm not talking about oxygen depletion or other organic volatile or chemicals like acids that could be present in some environment. But with respect to particulates, we can use different types of respirator. And what we see here is the APF, is the protection factor, basically. And the protection factor increase whether you use the N95 to your right, and then the half mask with the P100 filter, which is similar to an EPA filter. And then you will have an increased protection factor of 50. So this could be summarized by, you can be exposed like up to 10 times. You can be protected up to 10 times the exposure limit But as we can see with the next presentation by Perry, you will see that these limits are also very variable from one country to another. So to which point are you protected when you are wearing these equipment? If the concentration is, permissible concentration varies from one location to another. That's an interesting question. So still the use of full face with a battery operated, this is the best practice, but of course it's the best equipment to protect you. But then there's the battery, the maintenance, all of these issues that comes together. All of these require some fit testing to ensure proper efficiency and the proper use of these equipment. Of course, there are also some limitations with respect to the availability and to the comfort in some environment. When you are exposed to heat or to strong effort, you may have an additional restriction wearing these equipment. So this is why we we indicate that these has to be used more in last resort. So in conclusion, I would just conclude that more emphasis must be put on eliminating and reducing exposure at the source. We need to really remove the contaminant as it's being exposed, and we need to reduce exposure. And when reducing exposure means reducing illnesses, lost time, and improve quality of life and productivity. As we could see with René and Eduardo's presentation, we're talking a lot about mortality, but what about all these workers that need to live with all these lung disease that we don't have all the data, but I can tell you that it's like it's really like an iceberg, what we see with respect to fatality when we compare to all these people living with these illness. So government and industry must invest in primary prevention and in occupational hygiene expertise, and we can eradicate TB and reduce silica with a joint approach. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll be pleased to answer your question at the end of this webinar. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, René. With René's talk, we are able to see the importance of the role of industrial hygiene in the surveillance and control of silica exposure, and that we can eradicate TB and reduce silica with a joint approach. Okay, so now we go to the last but not the least presentation. Perry Gottesfeld is the Executive Director of Occupational Knowledge International, or OK International, a non-government organization. He founded OK International in 1999 to address inequities in occupational and environmental standards between developed and underdeveloped countries. OK International has implemented safer mining projects to reduce silica dust exposures in small-scale and artisanal mining communities in Asia and Africa. Gottesfeld obtained his Master's of Public Health in Biomedical and Environmental Health Sciences from the University of California at Berkeley. He co-chairs the ICOH subcommittee on silica dust exposure and tuberculosis. His topic somehow wraps up this webinar towards further action plan. To talk on silica standards, the case for updating and adapting occupational exposure limits, please welcome Perry Gottesfeld.
Thank you, Jinky, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Occupational Knowledge International is a nonprofit NGO based in the US, but we work exclusively around the world in partnership, typically with other NGOs or governments, to bring technical capacity to occupational environmental health issues. We have worked on the link with silica dust and tuberculosis for the past 20 years, generally in small informal sector workplaces, including mining and stone crushing in Asia and Africa, and have introduced low-cost systems to greatly reduce these exposures in those environments. Today I'm going to be talking about the need for updating silica standards, occupational exposure limits globally, and review how we could use this as a tool to raise the profile on the link between silica exposure and tuberculosis. So to reiterate what some of the other speakers have already said, this is not a problem exclusive to miners. This is anywhere we see silica dust exposure, we're increasing the risk of tuberculosis in those societies. And this has been shown in multiple studies that have been published on ceramic workers, sand miners, marble stone workers, whetstone cutters, construction workers, other stone crushers, and in India, the slate pencil workers, which work with soapstone. And this involves, very conservatively, at least 230 million people around the world, which is probably a great underestimate. And in terms of the world of silica occupational exposure limits, the big news in in recent years is that the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration updated its standard for the first time in 45 years and adopted a permissible exposure level of 0.05 and an action level of 0.025 milligrams per cubic meter. Australia did the same last year, but very few countries have followed suit to update their standards, and even more alarming, very few countries have any standards whatsoever. It's also important to note that very few countries have any kind of requirement that products containing crystalline silica have a warning label. And this is particularly important when we look at construction industries where these materials are quite common. And so this would be one other consideration in looking at how to update your country's standards. A couple of years back, we did a review of the occupational exposure limits that we could identify in countries around the world and published this at the reference below, and found the overall mean for occupational limits was 0.1 milligrams per cubic meter, but quite variable from country to country. And to put that in perspective, the threshold limit value, the TLV, put out by the American Conference on Governmental Industrial Hygienists is 0.025. And as you can see from this table, there's only a few countries that have implemented that lower standard, including Mexico, Portugal, and British Columbia, as Canada does it by province. It's also important to note that the US update to the exposure limit did not cover miners. It did not cover the mining industry. So that is work yet to be done, and hopefully that'll happen here in the next few years. But most importantly, we find that most countries have no standard at all. And this is quite alarming given the prevalence of this exposure globally. We also want to point out that there are very old standards being used around the world. Even when the EU adopted its binding occupational exposure limit in 2017, they chose a standard of 0.1. Now that's a minimum standard, and countries can lower their standards further. Some have, but again, this would not be fully protective. And China and India both use variable exposure limits based on the percent of silica present in the sample. So what we would like to see, and what's important about these standards, is not just the occupational airborne limit, but that these trigger specific responses. And it's these responses that are going to ultimately protect workers. So for example, in the US context, these occupational limits would trigger worker training programs, medical surveillance programs, including the need for TB testing on an annual basis. It includes respiratory protection and which respirator to use under which exposure limit, other exposure controls, ventilation, work practices, engineering controls, and it triggers ongoing air monitoring. Now, other provisions that countries can consider adopting are quite varied that would be linked to this. But for example, even something very basic like requiring electricity or a water supply for wet spray technology at any licensed facility would be a basic improvement. Because often, at least in developing countries, we see that licensed, regulated facilities don't even have full link to the electrical grid or sufficient water supply to actually implement controls. And also we'd like to see stricter siting criteria to require the location of these outdoor sites like stone crushers and sand mines be kept away from residential areas. There should be worker compensation programs built into these measures that would put the burden of the cost of silica-related disease, including tuberculosis, on employers. And finally, it would be good to see greater transparency where companies are required to report or post exposure data. So one of the it is clear in just in most countries around the world, there's very few resources to implement these standards and to enforce them. But just by merely the act of putting out a standard, this could greatly increase awareness of the link between TB and silicosis and silica exposures. And even in the case of the US, this was recognized in 2016 with the new standard, where they noted that this is linked to latent TB infection converting to active disease. And as a result, they required that there be testing for latent TB. In addition, it's also recommended that the worker training program address tuberculosis as part of the hazard communications. Everyone is well aware that India has a huge informal sector in stone mining and some formal mines as well. These are known to have very high levels of respirable silica. The good news in India is that some states have begun to put in compensation programs for silicosis victims. Unfortunately, these are not recognizing tuberculosis as a compensatable disease among these workers. But a recent study published just last year showed that even with the Indian standard in place, about half of the 71 air samples collected from 17 various stone mines exceeded the Indian standard, and almost all exceeded the US OSHA limit. So this is to say that just having a standard isn't good enough. We know enforcement's going to be a huge problem, but certainly by adopting a new standard or updating an old standard, it greatly raises the profile of this issue. And the authors in that particular case do call for lowering the concentration limits and the standard in India to be in line with guidelines followed in other countries. To make the case to regulators and policymakers and politicians that you need to implement new standards, it's important to point to the cost effectiveness of these measures. We know that preventing silicosis by itself, by investing in engineering controls to reduce silica dust emissions, is one of the most cost-effective public health interventions in the workplace. And furthermore, investments in dust controls are way more cost-effective than investing in public health programs to identify and treat cases of TB. And this is true even without considering the co-benefits of preventing silicosis, lung cancer, and other silica-related disease. So in conclusion, what we have found in our survey of exposure standards around the world is that countries with the highest burden of TB generally have the weakest silica exposure limits. And several countries with the lowest burden of TB have recently updated their silica exposure limits, ironically. So countries without silica dust exposure limits generally don't have requirements for worker training, medical surveillance, or dust controls. And if we're going to try to push formal sector employers to put in these measures, we need to get silica standards in place. But we also need to use this as a tool to raise the awareness of the global health community and the public health community to pay attention to this issue, because this is one of the only ways that we can actually prevent TB instead of just treating it as a medical emergency. And one resource I want to point your attention to is the ICOH call for action that we published in 2018 on preventing tuberculosis among silica dust exposed workers. In that document, we specifically call for national TB programs to include silica dust controls in those strategies. Unfortunately, most national TB strategies do not address this issue. A handful of them do discuss silicosis as being a risk factor, but very few actually address silica dust in the workplace and the need to control silica dust in the workplace as a prevention measure. It's also been highlighted that mercury reduction programs, largely funded through the Minamata Convention, are becoming common in small scale informal mining around the world. And it's important that we use this opportunity to incorporate the need for dust controls into those programs instead of looking at this as a element specific, mercury specific intervention. We also need to encourage international lenders, including the World Bank and Asian Development Bank and others, to incorporate strict dust controls into their infrastructure projects around the world for mining and construction in particular. And finally, we need action on the part of governments to regulate these exposures, and on the part of the global health community to recognize the need to invest in these prevention measures. So with that, we'd like to switch to a Q&A format with the little time we do have left, and hopefully address some of the questions that have come in through the Google form that you've been provided the link. However, if for some reason we do not get to everybody's questions and comments, I assure you that we will forward them to the speakers to respond to you individually if we run out of time. But I do see that there are a couple of questions have come in, and if I could ask the other speakers to unmute themselves, we can then proceed with the few minutes we do have left for this presentation. So I'd like to start by addressing the first question to Rodney Ehrlich that came in earlier. And the question was, how can your recent study help highlight the need for silicosis and TB prevention, disease management, and the review of occupational exposure limits?
Thanks. Thanks for that question, Christopher. You know, I think it's probably a single approach to get the occupational exposure limits down is really meant to cover all diseases. And I think the 0.025 is based on preventing lung cancer, not silicosis, if I'm under correction. So as a start, one would say that if stricter OELs are used, it should reduce the risk of tuberculosis. However, there is a belief that it's only a problem, perhaps in countries which don't have strict OELs, when workers develop silicosis and then get tuberculosis as a clinical complication. So it needs to be reframed as an occupational health and a public health problem, which will put pressure on OELs. With regard to management of Silica-Tuberculosis, we don't really have the time to discuss it because there are so many aspects. But The South African mining industry probably has more experience than anywhere else in the world, and they were starting to get control of their TB when the HIV epidemic hit. So it's really highly contextual. It depends on living conditions, it depends on migrancy, it depends on co-infection, co-epidemics such as HIV, and the availability of medical services. But when you get down to the clinical level, you're talking about surveillance, because the two diseases look similar on radiology. Diagnosis becomes a problem. Treatment specificity. We've recently done work which shows that some miners in Lesotho have been treated for tuberculosis 5 times, with only one ever showing bacteriological proof. So what's happening, in fact, is that TB is being overtreated because they're not diagnosing silicosis. The question of latent TB infection or tuberculosis preventive treatment is tricky because they're continuing to be exposed. So you're treating miners to sterilize, as it were, against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but they continue to be exposed to silica and reinfection. The same actually applies to healthcare workers in high TB burden countries, which is one of the reasons that TPT is only recommended by WHO for low TB burden countries. So that area needs research, it needs operational thinking, and a policy adapted to the high TB burden countries. So I think that's all I really want to say about the, I think, target to low OEL and get to it, make sure that the clinical community, the public health community understand the problem and start to tease apart or interrogate their own practice to achieve the type of specificity that we need to treat these people properly and to make sure it stays on the public health agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, Rodney. Eduardo, we have a quick question for you as well. Do you have any information on the incidence of silicosis among gemstone polishing workers in Brazil?
Okay, that's a very nice question. The brief answer is no.
Okay.
I mean, it's very difficult to get numbers from this group of people because first they are spread over the country. Second, they don't like medical officers or medical services to investigate them because they think that these official services will be interfering in their prospection and so on. It's not an easy group to analyze and to get information on incidents of silicosis, but I would say it's high. There's a high incidence. Thanks.
Okay, in the few minutes we have left, I'd like to just cover a couple of the comments that have come in and just assure everyone that speakers will have an opportunity to reply to some of the more technical questions that have come in via email. And please feel free to contact us as well after the webinar ends. But one question or one comment that came in is, how could we better manage TB prevention in healthcare facilities? And I think it is important to note that there is a link between high burden communities with silica dust exposure and bringing that to healthcare communities, to healthcare workers, excuse me. Maybe with COVID also, there's some good news in that there's going to be heightened awareness now about better protecting health workers that we could look at. There was also a comment about how do we usefully use these exposure limits when many countries don't have the laboratory resources to conduct the analysis for respirable crystalline silica. And this is a huge problem as well around the world. And it is of concern that the technical means for analyzing air samples here is quite complex and not readily available in most countries. So I would say that's also a very good point.
Yeah, Noel Perry, just to extend on that question, you're right. At some point there are some technologies that you can have direct reading and you can measure and have an immediate answer, or at least an assessment. But when it comes to silica or tuberculosis, you need to grab a sample and bring it to a lab to have it analyzed. So I hope eventually we can develop technology that can help you have more direct reading equipment. Of course, there's been great improvement in the last couple of years where we could see a more particulate analysis in direct reading, where you can have a greater portion of the PM10, PM7, PM5, PM1, and you can have a better idea of the size. But still, it doesn't tell you if it's silica, or if it's just typical particulates. But I think there are some improvement done in that field of analysis. And at least when you get some of these equipment, when they are available, it gives you a primary assessment of what are the levels of, when you also have other criteria, just like the total particulate that, let's say, is 10 milligram per cubic meter. In these environments, when there's high level of silica, there's usually high level also of total particulate. So you can also use some cross indication, which is not perfect with identifying the exact concentration, but at least there are some tools that can be used and assess what are the level for the silica, especially the TB. Of course, there's no way we can test that on field, and it requires definitely additional lab analysis, and they are not practically available everywhere.
Thank you. In the minute or two we have left, I just would like to add that our subcommittee and the larger MinOSH committee of ICO would welcome your participation and welcome suggestions on how to take this issue, to raise this issue amongst governments and global health funders going forward. We need more awareness and more interventions to really take this to where it's necessary to prevent TB in these and silicosis in these high-risk workers. So we invite you all to contribute to that. And finally, I'd like to turn the webinar back to Eric to close our meeting and thank everybody for their participation.
Thank you so much to everybody. It has been a real pleasure attending this first webinar of MinOSH, organized by the Subcommittee on Tuberculosis and Silica, and thanks to you for organizing it. Also, thank you very much to our 4 excellent presentations. I really liked them. It's a pleasure to hear such qualified people telling us about these issues. And as said by Perry, all the listeners or participants are welcome to join or becoming members of ICO and MinOSH and stay updated on what we are doing and contribute to this on occupational health and safety in mining. And remember, we'll be back end August with the next webinar. And then I also want to give a special thanks to our Indonesian colleagues and friends, because you really made it possible to celebrate this webinar. Thank you so much to you out there in Indonesia. And with these few words, I want to thank you once again and close this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.